Well then, let's talk about the green light. Donald Trump has recently and officially approved a bipartisan bill in the United States on sanctions against the Russian Federation. This was stated by U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham. On social media, he wrote that this decision is timely since, and I quote, Ukraine is making concessions for the sake of peace, while Putin only talks and continues to kill innocent people. Graham added that this bill would allow the U.S. president to punish those countries that buy cheap Russian oil. So, Mr. Stanislav, what is your outlook on the prospects? After all, we've mentioned this bill, this initiative, including with you, more than once, to put it mildly. What has changed this time?
I think that, after all, the American president doesn't understand that. The approaches that he has used over the past year, let's put it that way, I wouldn't call them particularly decisive. They just don't work. But when the U.S. Treasury decided to impose sanctions against both Rosneft and Lukoil, that actually had a significant and noticeable effect. Back then, the Kremlin actually made contact with the relevant parties, and that's when, let's say, this particular phase began, the phase of negotiations that we are currently in right now. Of course, we can't predict right now whether it'll be successful or not. We understand that the Russian Federation is not planning to stop its aggression yet, but nevertheless, it did have an effect. And I think Trump understands that this is exactly how the desired outcome can be achieved. Will the sanctions that were announced actually be implemented? Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, at this point in time, we can't say for sure. I do not rule out the possibility that, for now, this can be seen as a kind of threat. In other words, through Graham, Trump often sends such signals. At least that's how I interpret it. You mentioned Medvedev. Medvedev sends messages from Russia that Putin perhaps can't say publicly. And here we see Graham playing that role. At least partially he fulfills that function. So he demonstrates that the American president understands everything clearly and is fully prepared to act more decisively if, let's say, the need arises. And against the backdrop of all these events related to Venezuela, the story with those tankers and so on, we can assume that the American leader might actually go for something like this. The only question that remains now is how exactly we should respond to this situation. And now we can clearly see that the main focus is specifically on introducing additional secondary restrictions, which could potentially impact those countries that are currently buying those same Russian energy resources. And here, many need to get ready for this. We see that there is progress. For example, in the context of India, and it is gradually moving away from Russian energy resources. By the way, I want to point out something specific. Since the year 2022, India has actually become the single largest buyer of that Russian crude oil transported by sea, which notably was being sold at discounted prices, making it more accessible to a wider range of customers. And by the way, there was a significant meeting that took place in Paris just yesterday. It was a diplomatic gathering between the foreign ministers of the Weimar Triangle countries, namely France, Germany, and Poland, as well as the Indian foreign minister. The discussions held during this meeting were considered important for international relations. They discussed these issues, and right now, a very interesting situation is unfolding. Specifically, Europe is trying to win India over to its side, that is, to the side of the free world, and perhaps India will sign on. A free trade agreement between the European Union and India may soon be signed, which could, for example, offset India's losses if it decides to give up Russian energy resources. And overall, New Delhi is sending some pretty positive signals. And I want to remind you that there were also restrictions imposed by the Donald Trump administration, specifically when there were talks about deadlines concerning India. And yet, these restrictions are working. Back then, there were a lot of discussions about whether it would work or not. And there were different signals, different information, supposedly that India was refusing oil, supposedly not, Russian, well, and in general, it's hydrocarbons. But we can see that, after all, this is having a positive effect. So I think that in the near future, we will see some pretty important news for all of us. News. But I want to emphasize that none of this happens all at once. It's all a complicated process. And for all of this to start being put into practice, to have any effects, It takes some time, because when certain countries start to feel the impact, if, for example, secondary restrictions are imposed and there are economic losses, they realize it's better to look for alternatives in the world. I think that Donald Trump is also ready to present himself as an alternative. For example, he offers his energy resources to European countries. So it's a very subtle and multifaceted game here, which perhaps Putin does not fully realize, or maybe he does, but has become a prisoner of his own ambitions. And that's why he can't stop the war against Ukraine. But in any case, it is clear that sanctions and other measures, as well as additional actions taken by the international community, will undoubtedly have their effect on the Russian dictator as well. In the end, he'll have to make a choice, whether he ultimately agree to sign some relatively compromised agreement on a ceasefire? Or will Russia, let's say, ultimately face even more devastating, severe, and truly catastrophic consequences than it does now?